This is a fantastic way of approaching the veracity of the Gospels, the claims of the Gospels, the existence of Jesus and the things that he taught, what was passed on from the very first apostles, and it's cradled in the Catholic Church. This episode with Gary Michuta is how the Catholic Church proves the veracity of the Bible, how the Catholic Church proves the Bible. It's a fantastic way of looking at this. It's, in a nutshell, the idea that the Bible existed and was written in real communities with real people. The authors talk about real places you can go and test and see and visit these places, and that these communities pass on not just the text of the Bible, but uniquely, and this is where the Catholic Church, I think, comes in here, uniquely passed on the meaning of these texts, right? What does John 6 mean? What does it mean when Christ talks about baptism or the Eucharist? What does it mean? How do we understand and orient the Last Supper? How do we understand the connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament? How do we know what books belong in the biblical canon? These things this week, my guest, Gary Michuta, fantastic apologist, writer, researcher, unpacks in a beautiful fashion. I think you'll love this. Really opens up, I think, a brand new way of looking at some of these big questions. This is how the Catholic Church proves the truth of the Bible with Gary Michuta. It's a slam dunk. Please watch and enjoy. Hey friends, welcome back to the show. Thanks for watching. Thank you for listening. If you are watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to this channel, follow it, hit the bell so you're notified when all the videos come out each and every week. And please do interact in the comments. Let us know what you think of this episode, questions, comments, feedback, the weird things you guys do on YouTube, but please be nice, play nice out there, and thanks for watching. If you are listening on podcast, thank you. Please make sure you follow the show wherever you find it. And if you are listening on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, please just press pause in just a moment and please leave a rating or a review if you can. Those help push the podcast out to new listeners who can hear conversations like this one this week, and we're in for a fantastic one. My friends, I am joined by a return guest of the show. It's been a while, Gary, but he's back again. Gary Michuta. He is the author of a number of fantastic books, including Revolt Against Reality, Fighting the Enemies of Sanity and Truth, From the Serpents to the State, Hostile Witnesses, How the Enemies of the Church Prove Christianity, The Case for the Deuterocanon, Arguments and Evidence, and, of course, Why Catholic Bibles Are Bigger. He is the host of Hands-On Apologetics on Virgin Most Powerful Radio, a fantastic radio show out each and every day, and the author, for our purposes here today, a brand new book from St. Paul Center, from Emmaus Road Publishing, The Gospel Truth, How We Can Know What Christ Taught. Gary, I am thrilled to have you back. Thanks for being here. Welcome and hello.
Yeah, hey, it's great to be back. And wow, what an intro. I actually feel like I accomplished something.
You have. I mean, Gary, if nothing else, Why Catholic Bibles Are Bigger, Gary, you could have written that book and just sat in your laurels, I think, for the rest of your life and been the guy who wrote that book, because that book is the book, honestly, for so many of us converts like myself, Gary, that's the book that we go, Gary, what? Because you just open our eyes to this thing that, like, so many people are their minds are blown by. So, if nothing else, Gary, that accomplishment you could have just done and sat back, and we would have been in awe of you. Never mind everything you've done since then, Gary. So happy to have you. It's been a minute. I'm looking back at the archives here, episode 86, and we're on 214 now is this one. So it's been a while, Gary. I apologize to you and the listeners because we've been deprived of Gary Michuta, but you're back. And we're so thrilled. And Gary, this is a fantastic new book. I think if I can inflate your head a bit more before we get into it, Gary, this is the kind of thing that honestly, if I think of Gary Michuta, I think of this is the kind of thing that you do best. It's this book is deep research. It's thinking in a way about the question of the Bible and of Christ and who he was and who wrote about who he was and what happened in this. I don't know how to describe it the best, but this really intense research-based, deep thinking, asking questions that I don't think maybe a lot of people or researchers or academics are necessarily asking, presenting it in a new way. I mean, you do this awesome, fresh work, Gary, that I think is so beneficial that then people will use and read and carry forward into how they present the gospel and defend Jesus and the church and these things. So kudos on another fantastic book, Gary. This is awesome, and maybe you could tell us to begin with kind of the genesis of this idea. Like, where did this idea come from for you? Do you just sit down there in that studio and just research all day long? What do you?
Yeah, it seems like it. You know, my books are usually. My books usually are the end result of me trying to remember all sorts of stuff that I've discovered, and it just becomes too much. So I figure, okay, I'm going to organize. I'm going to put it in print, and that way, if I ever need to access it, I have a book I can open it up and get. So it's like my books generally are, at least I think the shortest one's maybe 4 years of research, and the longest one's probably 10. Or maybe even more. This one, I've been, putting this stuff in my back pocket over and over again. And then I thought, you know what, it's time to use this approach, because I think there's some very good books out there. A lot of them Protestant evangelical books that vindicate the text of Scripture, but there's a whole bunch of questions they don't ask. And I think, me as a Catholic, I can, take what they do and run with it and show how, we could have a really, really strong case for how we can know what Jesus actually taught.
Yeah. And I love it. I love the idea that these are your research notes gathered for you to remember them, and then just shared with everybody else so we can enjoy the fruits of your labor.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. It reminds me of something that, there are certain people like yourself. I think of Eric Ibarra, another one that I think of, these guys that you guys do the hard work of rigorous research, citation and study and work, and we all just benefit. We just ride in your coattails and benefit from all your hard work. So I love it, and I love this approach. So this book is a defense kind of how we know Christ came, Christ lived. The Bible is true. Mm-hmm. But adding a Catholic, the weight of what the Catholic Church has. Adding on to an evangelical perspective. Is that that's a bad summary? Actually,
yeah, no, that's essentially it. Yeah, that's essentially it. It's there's more to the story. If you really take the idea that Jesus established a community that's structured, that persists throughout history, that strength alone, you can draw all sorts of interesting arguments. And that can solve a lot of problems. With the evangelical treatment of vindicating the Gospels tend to be, to my ear, kind of thin. And it leaves open some really good questions by atheists. Like, let's say the text I have in front of me is, even if you could prove it's identical to the original, how do you know that text belongs in the Bible? And how do you know what the proper interpretation of that text is? And how do you know that the text I have, the people who wrote it, didn't lie or fabricate or exaggerate? Those are really basic questions. But if you don't take the early church seriously and actually see it as a believing community, it's like extremely hard to answer that in a satisfying way.
Yeah. So I love that. So in a sense, this idea as a Protestant, right, the Bible kind of was put together and passed on, but there's no exact kind of hand-to-hand, no links in that chain, right? Especially if you have the narrative that the church fell into apostasy. Well, that then begins to cause problems for your narrative of, well, then how do you know the Bible wasn't corrupted or wasn't fabricated in certain ways? What I think you're saying is then, actually, as a Catholic, we have this stronger argument because we believe the church in its authority, first of all, canonized the Bible and then passed it on, and we have those linkages all the way through. There was no dark ages, no time the church fell into apostasy and things could have been corrupted or damaged or added on. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's demonstrable too. I mean, there is a way or a method that you can use to determine certain things. So one of the big themes that go out through my book, The Gospel Truth, is verification. You know,
Yeah.
I believe the Gospels were written in such a way that it would be deliberately made to pass on information accurately. And I also believe that that the early Christians verified what was written. And I give you some evidence for that. And then once you step a generation later, you know, how can we verify that we have the correct interpretation or meaning of it? How can we verify whether or not they told the truth? How can we verify which books belong in Scripture and which ones don't? All of them are basically follow the same methodology, and that methodology is something that, you know, is well known by Catholics and Orthodox.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's a wonderful approach, Gary. Very, again, this is the thing, very refreshing. I love how you tackle these things from really a unique perspective. I love that, Gary. So let's maybe begin with this question. Jesus came. That's not a question. Jesus came. He lived. He taught. He died. Rose from the dead. He didn't say, write a book, pass it on to my followers. So I guess the first question, as somebody who says, how do we know this is true? I mean, the first question might be, well, Jesus, there's no evidence that Jesus said, write this down and pass this on. So how do we know that this is what Jesus did that was passed on? Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. And usually non-believers will focus on the fact that there is a gap where things were transmitted orally, and then eventually they were written down. And how do you know during that gap, like legends didn't slip in, or embellishments, or, you know, things like that? And well, in my book, what I basically do, here's a tiny spoiler alert, is, you know, when God decides to take on our humanity and disclose himself to us, he ties into Jewish culture. Of all the cultures in the world, he picks the Jewish culture that already had a mechanism for passing on teaching accurately from a rabbi to the disciple. And so at the beginning of my book, what I do is I look at what do we know about this method of transmission. Then I look at the Gospels to see, did Jesus tap in? Is there evidence in the Gospels that he's using this methodology? And he does. And not only that, but he even supersedes it. And so that right there tells you, okay, there's a very good probability that these writings are the fruit of the disciples who learned this from Jesus. And then I started looking at the gospel texts themselves, and I look for signs in the text of a kind of formatting, so that Jesus, for example, he presents himself, or his words, his discourses, even the places that he has the discourses, are all pre-made so that it could be remembered for a long period of time. There's lots of memory devices in work. And, you know, for us, you know, before I actually kind of found this out, and this is something well known in the scholarship, you know, you read the Bible and you go, well, that's just Bibleese. People just talk like that back then, you know. But actually, no, many of the things that you think is just biblical way of saying stuff is actually formatting. It's mnemonic formatting to help people memorize certain things. Like we use the same thing today. You know, if I said Mary had a little lamb, I think pretty much everybody could finish it, right? And the reason for that is because it's in there's a rhyme and a rhythm to that particular poem. And the same thing's true in the New Testament. There's a rhyme and a rhythm that you see throughout the Gospels. And then you have, okay, stop me if I'm going, I get excited about this, so I'm going to go deep into let me just share one of the coolest things. Okay, the earliest texts we have are in Greek. But the weird thing is, the Greek text at times speaks Aramaic, okay? It speaks Aramaic. And if you know Aramaic or Hebrew and you're reading the Greek text, you'll say, whoa, hold on, that sounds more Hebrew than Greek. And what I found is that at times we can spot this. It's really difficult to do. But we can spot that these memory devices are also on the level of a Hebrew or Aramaic original that was then translated into Greek, okay? Are you following me on that one?
Yeah.
And
that's great.
Let me show you the coolest thing that I found, okay? And it has to do with the Benedictus, okay? So we're talking Luke 1, 70 through 75, right? And Catholics are familiar with praying the Benedictus. Of course, this is what Zechariah's song, right? And there's a couple of lines in the song that just blew me away when I saw this. I learned this through a French scholar. The lines are, I'll just give you this: to perform the mercy promised to our fathers, to remember his holy covenant, the oath in which he swore to our father Abraham. Okay, just those 3 lines. What's really cool is there are 3 words in those lines to show mercy. Okay, the Hebrew for that is, let me make sure I get this, Hanan. Okay, that means to show mercy. That's the same root, Hebrew root, for the name John, Yohanan. Okay, then there's the to remember is zakar in Hebrew, which is the root for the name Zechariah. Okay, and then to remember is, or swear an oath is Shabbat. Excuse me. To swear an oath is a Shabbat, which is the root for Elizabeth, Eli Shabbat. Okay, so you're in these 3 lines. You have the 3 names of John, Zechariah, and Elizabeth, but it's in the Hebrew. It's buried underneath the Greek. So it's like, wow. So there must be like original layer of Hebrew or Aramaic that was a memory device, but then it's hidden by the Greek, right? So what's going on? You know, if this was a fabrication, it should be out in plain day, right?
Yeah.
But instead it's hidden. And if you didn't know Hebrew, you wouldn't know it was there. So it's like what I pose in my book, and I give you tons and tons of instances like that, is if this was a fabrication, it is so over-engineered. You know, it's like no one would make a fake story with all these intricacies. It just smacks of being authentic.
That's amazing. So not only are you finding this beautiful evidence that the Gospels were passed on orally, and there are these devices that make it pretty obvious that it was engineered. It was built to be passed on orally, I guess, until it was written down. Right? Is the idea? You're finding in that oral passing down, you're finding such devices, such mechanisms to help remember these the Gospels, that it would be insane to actually have tried to fabricate this in some way. Would have taken some kind of very complicated operation, right? Is that it?
Yeah, and I mean, and why hide it? You know,
right?
I mean, a fabrication, you'd want to kind of show your hand, because that will give it lended credibility. Why bury it under another language? And the cool thing is, ultimately the source has to be Jesus. Jesus must have gave these discourses and so on in a formatted way. And it's just, it blows your mind, the genius that went into all these different layers of formatting. It's almost as if Jesus is divine.
I think that's amazing. So not only do we have a book that's miraculous in the nature that it contains miracles, right? It has survived for such a long period of time. I mean, the Bible is pretty miraculous in that it's that it gives us a picture of such ancient times, Old Testament, New Testament. It also contains within the actual writing, the passing on of it, these kind of crazy, miraculous elements that point to, I mean, even on a deeper level, a divine author. That's amazing. I mean, I'm trying to think of like an analogy of that. Like, I don't know, like opening up a computer and finding, maybe like, I don't know, a computer went back in time, right? And some ancients find a computer and open it up, and you're seeing layers upon layers of engineering in this, and you just keep peeling things back and finding, oh, look at this, and then, here's a microprocessor, oh, here's even smaller like parts of this and smaller parts of this. It just seems like that all points back to some kind of amazing creator, and I love that it's layers of evidence like that. That's really interesting, Gary. I love
it's not
stuff.
one or two. It's like there's tons of it, and you have to sit back and say, okay, it's not a fabrication. Okay, so, but then the question is, can you be verified? And you mentioned miracles, and the method I use when I treat that in the book is miracle claims. I take it like trying to cash a check. Okay, if you try to cash a small check at your bank or your credit union or whatever, for $5, $10, $15, they'll just run it through the machine. You get money, no problem, right? But if you're trying to cash a check that's like 10,000, 100,000, million, you're going to have to come inside, get your ID. You're going to have to get fingerprinted probably. They're going to call the other bank. They're going to verify it, right? Because the risk that if this check bounces, right, the bank's out of, $100,000 million, right? They're going to verify it. And so what I do is I look at the Gospels, and they write some really big checks, in terms of what Jesus said and did. Yeah. And so it's like, did the earliest Christians, the first readers of these documents, did they have an incentive to verify? Yeah, absolutely. Does the Gospels give enough information that they could verify it? Yeah, they do. And I'll give you another spoiler alert. One of my favorites is in the Bread of Life discourse in John 6, which is very familiar, right? Yeah. But I bet there's a verse there that never made sense if you're reading it closely, okay? Right after Jesus multiple times says, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood, and unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life within you, right? Right at the end of that, suddenly the narrator jumps in. It's really weird. It's like Jesus gives this discourse, and it's almost like the old-time TV commercial or news breaks or something. We interrupt this program to give you a very important message, right? And it's the narrator, and he says, these things Jesus said while teaching in the synagogue of Capernaum. Then it's like, now back to a regularly scheduled program. And then it just starts over again, with the discourse, or it continues on. And it's like, why did the narrator feel the need to jump into this discourse and say where exactly Jesus gave these words? Well, obviously, it's kind of a dare to verify, right? Because people listening to this would think, oh, Jesus would never say something like that, eating flesh and drinking blood. This must be a fabrication. Well, the narrator or the author obviously felt, no, I need to give you a little apologetic card. Just go over to Capernaum, ask the people in the synagogue, see if I'm lying, right? And so it's like, there's a dare to verify. They're throughout the Gospels. They're writing big checks that it would have been incumbent on the first Christians or converts to Christianity to check out. And ultimately, they did check it out. And there's evidence in the New Testament that, these things were verified by the first community. Because after all, whether you're a Gentile or a Jew, you had a lot to lose if you became a Christian. Right. So, of course, you would naturally verify this stuff.
Yeah. That's what Paul does, right? In Corinthians later on, the same idea. Like, these guys saw Jesus rise from the dead. They're alive. Go ask them, right? Go cash that check. It's a similar thing, but kind of on a grander scale, but just saying like, look, this is it. I love that. I think dare to verify is the right way of putting it, because it's almost a dare. I think truth or dare, go ahead, go ask them, go check that out, walk over there and see. You'll see I was there, and that for me, Gary, underscores the veracity of the accounts, but also the importance of that miracle or that teaching in John 6, right? Yeah, it's as if the divinely inspired author knew that this was a challenging teaching. I mean, you see all those followers walk away. You got to know that that's going to be something that readers will also be like, oh, this doesn't sit well with me. So he says, okay, well, go check it out. This really happened. This happened in a real place, in a real time. He really said this. I love that, right? And of course, if you're working on a fabrication, if you are creating a myth or a legend like this, you aren't going to put your cards on the table and challenge somebody to go and verify this like that, right?
No, you'd want it as vague as possible. Make it as most difficult as possible, and hopefully people just wouldn't make the effort to do it. But you find the opposite in the gospel.
And you see that with other not say myths and legends, but other stories. I'm thinking, for example, of say some of the Mormon texts, right? Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Church, the Mormon Church have certain texts that if you were to go and try and verify those, you couldn't find those times and those places that are listed in there. John's saying, go check it out, go see, and we know, of course, from the unbroken line that then the early church kind of fills in for us, that people could go and see this and do this, and that those first hearers and readers of the Gospels took Jesus, say, at his word in John 6, because they believed, based on their firsthand account from people who wrote these, and then reading them, this was a real thing in a real place and in a real time. They could verify this. I think that's yeah. I mean, after Jesus heals somebody or brings them back from the dead, they continue to live their life. Yeah. So, they would be around for 30, 40, 50 more years that you could ask them, hey, what happened? What happened to you? I heard that Jesus healed you. They could, that testimony lives on if you take the first community seriously, like it really is a community of people. And even in small towns, sometimes like memories last even longer, because not a lot happens in small towns like Nazareth, right? So it's, so any news is big news, and it could last for generations. And so I actually, last time, I think I traced the last Dare to Verify to Quadratus, who was writing, I think, around 125, 130 AD. So he's still saying, hey, there's some people around that were healed and raised from the dead that are still living. So they probably were pretty old at that point, but that's how far you can verify it, into the second Christian century. Yeah, that's amazing that they would have, and I guess it's a big deal, right? If you're the last guy living that was healed, that experienced the touch of Christ or a healing from the apostles or something. I mean, like that guy's a pretty big deal, right? We think of saints. We even think of people now that knew some of the saints, or saints that knew other saints, right? The closer you get to the source of a holy person, those people are big deals. Right? The people who are touched by any kind of miracle, right, involved in the canonization of a saint, right? So somebody that was involved with a healing miracle, like those people are popular people. Like everyone knows who they are. If you follow that particular saint or do any research or look into that, never mind somebody who experienced a healing from Jesus or who knew the apostles firsthand. And I love that, like, as you say, here's, I think, where the early church steps in, right? The Catholic Church begins to be the one to verify and to lend importance to the Gospels, to kind of stamp that approval when we see people like, in the early church looking back and saying, hey, this guy knew that. He's a verification point because he's a real person that lived in a real time and experienced these things. I think that, that's again where I think you mentioned before, the Catholic Church kind of next levels or lends more credibility to the veracity of the Gospels. And I think that's a great example of where that happens, right, Gary?
Yeah, absolutely. And not only them, but, they live by neighbors and they have family. And, so there's a whole group, a community, if you will, that could persist, where even if the person's died, there's still people who knew the person. They could recount the stories that he would say or she would say. And all of that lends to ability to verify even beyond the New Testament.
Yeah, because there are other sources. I know you have a fantastic book about hostile witnesses, right? And I think this is a fantastic book. You wrote a number of years back now, right? That looks at how witnesses or people, writers, recounters, researchers, historians who are actually hostile to Christianity, to the Catholic Church, tend, give us a witness for the Catholic Church, right? In their writing or rallying against the Church, actually lend credibility to the existence of some of the claims of the Church. And it's the same case for something like the Gospels, right? There are, and you have a whole chapter on this, right? That when people are speaking out against something, that lends credibility to that thing being a real thing to speak out against, right? I think that's, again, a brilliant Gary Michuta turn of thinking. And I love the way you think sometimes, Gary. That's amazing. Maybe talk a bit about that. So who are some of these witnesses that actually help us to verify the truth of the Gospels?
Specifically, what do you mean, hostile witnesses?
Yeah.
Well, I treat it briefly in this book, but like the hostile witness book is basically you have Roman historians, you have pagans that were mocking Jesus, and it's not super detailed, but it is these backhanded compliments that this stuff appears to have taken place. There really was a Jesus who really was crucified. There was a band of followers that still are hanging around. They claim that he rose from the dead. Basically, I would just refer people to hostile witnesses because there's quite a few, right? Quite a few that you could bring to the fore.
Yeah. And really, they're criticizing something that existed, right? So that lends credibility to that thing. I think that's amazing. Are there any other times when you were reading and researching and you said, this is an amazing instance of, I don't want you to spoil the whole book for us, and readers are going to want to read it, I think, either way, even with your teasers here, Gary, because there's a lot of fantastic content in here. But the other places where you're like, wow, this is an amazing thing that the author here has done that challenges readers to verify these facts. I'm thinking of, you mentioned John 6. I thought of in the epistles, Paul's kind of go ask them. Are there other times when you're like, wow, I didn't see that before, but that's a challenge.
Yeah, it's loaded with them. There's the chapter 21 of the Gospel of John. I mean, John ends twice. It's a strange gospel, right? It ends in 20, and then there's like an appendix, and it ends again. And at the very end of the 21 appendix, it says these things are true. The one who testifies is true, and we know it's true. Well, it's like, okay, well, how do you know it's true? Well, they either was disciples of John or they verified it themselves, And I have a feeling it's probably that group of disciples that were probably the last editors of the Gospel of John. I think that's probably the people who jumped into John 6 and a couple other places too. And then you have Luke's gospel. I mean, Luke says right off the bat in Luke that many have taken to compile a narrative of the events that happened before us. And he says, I'm going to after investigating everything accurately and new, I put in this orderly account for you, Theophilus, so that you can know the certainty of what you received. In other words, there's this body of teaching. Luke goes and does the homework. He does the research for that. And essentially the Gospel of Luke is a verification of what Theophilus was getting in his catechesis. And that's extremely early, right? I could go on and on. There's all these dares to verify. And the other thing too is like whenever I have the case of the magician in the basement, right? If a person claims that he healed somebody in their basement and there was just them and the person healed, that'd be really hard to verify. Probably it's fraud, right? I mean, how can you tell whether he really healed the person? Well, if there's 20 witnesses in the basement along with them, okay, that could be verified sort of, but it could be staged, right? You can still perpetrate a hoax. Well, let's take that magician and move him into the public sphere. And you can just keep doing it. And eventually you get to the point where it's like, oh, that would be really, really hard to fake. Like, for example, he does it in multiple locations in front of multiple audiences, including skeptics who have it in their best interest to debunk them, right? And the person's illness is well known. There's a history. And that's really, really hard to perpetrate. An unstaged audience with skeptics there. How do you do that? Well, then I go through the New Testament, you see Jesus's miracles, different locations, different audiences, and skeptics too that are there and watching it, and they don't debunk it. they kind of try to sweep it under the rug.
Yeah, yeah. And the authors of the Gospels point out the skeptics often, right? They're often mentioned. The Pharisees, the Sadducees are here. They're watching. The teachers of the leaders are watching. Like they you know, I guess as you look through the lens of the gospel authors, really planting this in reality, in history, really showing you the weight of this, the truth of this, you begin to see all these little things, don't you, Gary? You see these these witnesses who are watching, and they're mentioned. Oh, they were there, right? You can go and ask them if you if you want to challenge this account, right? I think that's really interesting. I think, you know, I as you were talking about John 21, I looked it up, and I'm like, yeah, weird. That little that little verse there, you see it, you don't see it until you really see it, and it's like,
right.
Interesting. It's obviously like a little postscript there, like this, you know, somebody saying that this is true. We've verified this. Wait a minute. Who are you? Who has verified this? But again, that's like we have. Wow, that's really interesting, right?
Yeah. And then I mean, there's other things too. For example, and I've seen this on skeptic channels on YouTube, where they make a really good point. And I think this is where evangelical defenses kind of wane, is they say, okay, fine. Let's say the text is accurate. Let's say it's generally reliable. How do you know that your interpretation of the text is correct? Because it seems like everybody has different interpretations. They're all contradictory. So even if we concede all these points, it's kind of worthless, you know? And so what I do is I show we can verify the meaning of a text. And I'm sure you've heard, it goes by a couple of different names, like the telephone game, where somebody whispers something in a person's ear and they whisper in another ear. Then it goes through a chain of people. Then the last person says what they hear, and it's totally different than the original. And so I totally blow away that whole scenario. That is not the way the scriptures and the meaning of the scriptures was passed on. It wasn't a telephone game. In fact, it's the exact opposite of the telephone game. It wasn't some meaningless phrase that was whispered in somebody's ear. It was an incredibly meaningful message that your salvation depends on, and if you accept it, you could be persecuted for. That was publicly proclaimed in front of people. You know, it's the opposite. And so, you know, again, if you take that community seriously, and then I do a mind experiment thing. It's like, okay, if you were sitting in John's church and John's preaching from his own gospel, he comes to the bread of life discourse and he says, this has to do with the Eucharist. How can you verify that he got it right? And then I take that, and then we go one generation later. Now you're in Ignatius of Antioch's church, who was a disciple of John. So, you know, he was taught by John. He was made a bishop, probably with John's acknowledgement. He does the same thing. Can you still verify that what that preacher, Ignatius, is saying is what was the original meaning, you know? And through that thought experiment, you see, there's multiple ways you could verify this very easily. And then you just take it generation after generation. And, you know, you could take it all the way to, you know, I usually stop at the end of the 2nd century with the Irenaeus of Lyon, who was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John, right? And with Irenaeus, he almost outlines, you know, hey, if you want to know what the original teaching was, check all the churches, right? And they, you know, basically it gives the canon of St. Vincent of Lérins that was taught from antiquity, from the beginning, ubiquity everywhere, and consensus by all or nearly all people. So check these churches out. And people did do that in the early church. There were people like Josephus who traveled all over the place verifying to make sure that, you know, one church somewhere is teaching the same thing as a church another place. Because that's where you have multiple attestations all coalescing into a unity. So that means there must have been a point of origin that was earlier than these sources from which these sources came. And when you have that, you have verification. So it actually, you know, now this is one of those things that was shocking to me. The more I thought about it, more I realized, actually, the longer you go in history, the easier it is to spot fabrications and alterations. Not harder. It actually gets easier because you have more and more data right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's, so the fathers of the 3rd, 4th, 5th century, they have something to tell us. There's evidence there for the original deposit of faith.
Yeah. And so if you see a fabrication pop up, you'll kind of see, based on when it pops up, well, nothing else backs this thing up here, right? So obviously this is a fabrication. I see what you say. It gets easier and easier as you have more data that's building and building and building. And again, I love this, Gary, because this is a uniquely kind of Catholic take on this. This lends the weight of the Catholic Church to this kind of apologetic argument, because of course, like you say, and I think this is really important to underscore, passing on the text, the gospel message, those gospels that were orally passed on, then written down, passing on the meaning of those teachings is as important as passing on just the content of those teachings, right? And the loss in Protestantism is that there's this kind of distinct break in the Reformation from the historical meaning of a lot of those teachings. The text continues to be passed on. Now, of course, truncated, we would argue, because Catholic Bibles remain bigger than the Protestant Bible after the Reformation. But the historic meaning of those teachings that were always historically passed on in tandem with the actual biblical text, that is lost for the most part in most of the Reformed, most of the Protestant traditions, right? And I think that is a huge shift if the meaning was always passed on with the text, as I think you're demonstrating. To lose that meaning, to separate those two things, well then, of course, you're going to result in a number of different denominations and arguments amongst the reformers and splits amongst Protestant churches and struggles to find meaning and collapsing denominations in the face of societal changes and stuff, because I'm sorry, I'm kind of soapboxing here, Gary, but you've fine. Split the text from the meaning, and those things always went together, right? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And now here's the beautiful thing about it. Someone might say, well, I don't know if that methodology is sound, what you just said about this meaning being passed on and so on. Well, you know what? It's the same basic methodology that we use to verify that our text of Scripture goes back to the original or the autograph. The same methodology, essentially. So if you say, well, I'm just going to follow the Bible, I don't need to verify meaning from the earliest Christians. No, because it's the same methodology. If one's wrong, then both are wrong, And that's why, as a Catholic, I think we can give a really robust and coherent defense, with all the bells and whistles. Again, if you just take that idea of a real physical, historical community that persists throughout history seriously, And so that was something I think is a little disarming, because like you said, it's not like you can deny one thing and just run away with the other, because if you deny the one, you ultimately undermine the other. And unfortunately, I think that's really what's happened as society has gone on. People see the problems, and they look at all these different interpretations. There's a book that was printed, I think in the early 1600s, and the title is 250 Interpretations of the Words, "This is my body." So this guy actually cataloged all the different interpretations of those few words. And when you look at that, you wonder, what's up with Christianity? This just seems like a mess, or like a Rorschach test that you look at ink blotches and try to make out whatever it means to you. But it's like, no, if the church is real and historical, there's this core meaning that's passed on. And of course, there's a lot of room for individual, interpretation and so on. But those large streams of doctrine are rooted there. Yeah. And that becomes important, because those are big questions, right? Baptism, what does it do? Yeah. How do we do it? When can we do it, right? The Lord's Supper, communion, the Eucharist, what is it? How do we do it? When do we do it? How often do we do it? These kinds of questions, right? How are we saved? Can we lose that? Is it a once for all decision? Is it based on our relationship with God? How do
What is sin? Are there different kinds of sins? How do I receive forgiveness for sins? All these are big questions, right? And of course, you could read your Bible that has been passed on to you and answer those questions. But you could also look to the tradition that's been passed along with the Bible and get the tradition, get the interpretation of the meaning that's been passed on, from the early church down through time, right? Yeah. And that again, I'm struggling to find words for this, Gary, but that's the thing. You want to be able to understand what the Bible means, and there is a way of doing that, of seeing that meaning was passed on from teacher to student to teacher to student down through time in a real tangible community. And we see that quite clearly in the Catholic Church and the early church fathers, passed on down through time.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, and you get the whole package, right? You not only get the text, but you also get the meaning of the text. You get the practices that's been going on since the beginning, the whole kit and caboodle when you join that original community, right? You get a really robust defense of it as well. Yeah. And like I said, without it, you undermine the scriptures. And I do dabble a little bit with the canon in here. I couldn't resist. But it's true, though. It's like, which books belong in the Bible? Which ones don't? How do you know that there aren't some books in there that aren't inspired? How do you know that there are inspired books that aren't included? That's kind of $100,000 question for our separated brethren, is the canon. And like you mentioned, the Old Testament canon, there's these 7 books that Catholics and Orthodox have that Protestants generally don't, and they certainly don't consider it inspired scripture. How do you adjudicate that problem, and who determines it? And again, it just comes down to the same methodology as, how do you know our text is identical to the original? How do you know what the meaning is? It's that the canon ties into that same kind of methodology.
Yeah. And you hit the problem as a Protestant of the church versus canon. How can you have one without the other kind of thing too, right? How can you have a canon without someone to tell me what the canon is? So I'm curious your treatment of the canon in this context. The book is, how can we know what Christ taught, right? How can we know the truth of the gospel? We wouldn't know what gospels to read apart from somebody adjudicating what gospels, because there are all kinds of gospels out there, right? That the church and historians now can show, this is a fabrication, this is a fabrication. We can see that in hindsight and understand that, as the text of the gospels of the New Testament was being put together, the church left some out, brought some in. That process, that's pretty important to knowing who Christ was, right? Because if we don't have the right gospels in there, our picture of Christ completely changes. So I guess there's an aspect of, I think, faith in there. There has to be faith that you have the right gospels. But I guess the question for me then is, well, I'm putting my faith in what exactly? Especially if I'm a Protestant, I'm putting my faith in the Catholic Church, that they got that right. That makes me a little bit nervous if I were a Protestant to go down that rabbit hole, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Or which epistles, and especially the Catholic epistles, they're usually what you'll hear is, well, if we could tie it to the apostle, then it's part of the New Testament. But there are some books in the New Testament that the authorship was doubted, like Epistle of Hebrews, for example. Also, some of the Catholic epistles. And remember, go back to Martin Luther. He himself had doubts as far as James and Jude, Revelation, second. Well, I can't remember. It was, I think, 5 old New Testament books that he actually didn't number in his first edition of the German translation. They were segregated from the rest of the New Testament, and that he's famously there for doubting. But if you think about it, well, how do we know that these writings are scripture? Ultimately, it's because the community that was there at the beginning understood that there was legitimate apostolic ties, and so it became part of that, what we call the deposit of faith. It's like a treasure that is, buried, if you will, but buried in public or publicly used that people can access. It's part of that. So even our inability to verify things, the witness of the early church makes up for whatever doubts there could be. That's if you take it seriously. And unfortunately for non-Catholics, they kind of have to steal a little bit of that and then deny it. We go by the Bible alone, but there's some things the early church that we can trust, But at that point, it's kind of like, well, what determines what you can and you can't trust? If they could get it right on which books are in the New Testament, why can't they get it right on what the New Testament says and teaches,
Yeah. That is always the problem. And again, that's the problem that I certainly encountered for myself looking into the early church, trying to square my faith as evangelical with the early church, right? There are bits you can affirm and appreciate and take in. Like you say, the canon itself is something that you need to really rely on the early church to say, yeah, they got it right. Those communities were reading the right books and passing them on. And ultimately, those guys called bishops, again, an awkward word for a non-Catholic to use, affirmed that councils, these books were fit for the canon. That becomes a bit of a sticky situation if you don't believe that the other things the bishops at those councils affirmed also were important, right? I can remember reading some of the texts of the early councils that were affirming, or the church fathers who were saying, here's my canon that's widely read. You look at what else those councils were doing, those fathers were affirming, you get into some weird territory. And you're in a place of like, how can I take this one thing from the early church, but I can't take these other things they also teach, right? For example, for me, it would be the same church that was baptizing infants and saying that baptism actually saves was giving me the New Testament canon, the biblical canon. Well, how could I throw the baby out with the bathwater? That's a good one. But take the Bible, right? You can't pick and choose like that from the very primitive church, right? How could they so early get this thing wrong, but this thing right now? And I'll take this, Gary, but I don't want that.
Even Protestants that do take history seriously, and they'll say, well, the New Testament, we could appeal to the North African councils of Carthage and Hippo, right? They affirmed the New Testament, and that's good enough. The 4th century, the church came to consensus. But just like you say, but they don't go to the Old Testament that also affirms the 7 deuterocanonical books that they reject. So it's like, so we'll accept everything within this little square here, and we'll just ignore all the other stuff.
Yeah, so even on the canon, they'll take part of the canon, but not the other part. Like that. That's really to me an extreme view, right? They got this part right, and this other part here that's like in the next paragraph, they got that part wrong, right? Yeah. And of course, we talked on the show, years ago now, Gary, but on that problem of right. So if you exclude these certain things from the text that you see as sacred and guiding your framework for how you do your faith, if you exclude these books, well, the faith you're doing won't contain the things that those books talk about, like prayers for the dead, those kind of things that we as Catholics, affirm and do because the scriptures we have those things in, and those were part of the faith that was passed down, from the apostles. But of course, if that's not part of your scripture, you aren't doing that. And if your scripture is formed if your faith is formed from scripture, well, what's in that scripture becomes really important to get right. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's even worse. It's when Protestants read their New Testament, they're reading it against the Old Testament backdrop that didn't exist for like 300-400 years earlier. Right? They're missing this whole period of time. Yeah. So it's like even the Judaism, when you move from the old to the new, it's a huge jump for Protestants, right? Yeah. And for non-Catholics, because the Jews also don't accept these books. And let me give you an example. I got an email from a Jewish person in England, and he's saying, what's all this stuff with the Trinity? The Trinity is pagan. It's obviously pagan. Jews would never believe anything like the Trinity. And I pointed out to him that, there's this whole period of development that's not in your Tanakh. not within what we call the Protestant canon. But within that deuterocanonical period, there's a development of Jewish thought where, God's wisdom becomes personified. And God's wisdom is like co-eternal with God. It's part of God, and yet it's distinct from God. And then there's the Spirit of God that also becomes personified, and the Logos understanding. All of this stuff happens within this small period of time. So if you don't have those books, it seems like teachings like the Trinity is like paganism that these Jewish Christians just grabbed onto. But if you look at that lost history, you see, no, this is authentic Judaism. They were coming really close to something that approaches John 1 through 4, right? But it doesn't happen until the Word actually does become flesh, that we can speak more explicitly about it. But without those books, it's like it just seems to pop out of nowhere.
Yeah, it reminds me of the church history class that I took in adult Sunday school in a Pentecostal church, right? And on the board is the Old Testament, this big period of darkness in the New Testament, right? And little do we know, no, actually, that was self-imposed by Protestant reformers who decided these books did not belong in the Bible and took them out, and now we don't know what happened in there because no was right. And of course, fascinating things like you say, and like the Dead Sea Scrolls. Dr. John Bergsma, guest on this show a number of times, who's written a fantastic book on the Dead Sea Scrolls and what that illuminates for us in terms of what the Jews were believing and practicing at the time of Christ, just before, and how, gosh, there were communities that looked very much like the very first Christian communities, doing things that looked very much like the very first Christian communities just before Christ came. But of course, that stuff is missing from large parts of the Old Testament. Those books were removed. So of course, that the table for the banquet is not quite set in the way that we as Catholics would argue. The Church, in her wisdom, argues should be set with those books belonging in the canon of Scripture, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's just when you get to the New Testament, they assume a lot, right? Yeah. Because it's like this is part of the air that they breathe, and they're connecting the dots and so on and so forth.
Yeah. That's wonderful. So the person who wants to defend Christianity, the Gospels, Christ as a real person, as these things as real, true events. I guess my question for you would be, what would be the number one kind of tip? Okay, number one tip is read your book. Go and get it and buy it, read it cover to cover. In addition to that, number two tip, then Gary, after they get the book and read it cover to cover, would you say would be a way that people could begin to show that yes, this was a real thing. We can really know and trust that what Christ said was this in the Gospels. What would you say to somebody who wants to defend that and to speak about that to somebody else?
Right. Yeah. Well, first, I think you need to be able to have a good reason why we should even be concerned about this Jesus of Nazareth. Yeah. Unfortunately, most people today, the only time they hear the name Jesus is when somebody swears. Yeah. So, and that's how I begin my book. It's like there's something strange that went on in the first century about this Jesus of Nazareth guy. And so what do we know about him that's solid? And I think that's the first thing. You need to whet their appetite and say, that there's this Jewish rabbi in the first century that was prophesied beforehand, which is weird, right? Yeah. And then there's this explosion of Christianity that radically reorders society and raises it up to new heights, from this uneducated teacher, right? A son of a carpenter. That should make the average person say, that's weird. Maybe I should look a little bit more seriously into Jesus. I think that's the first step that we often forget. Yeah. Then the second one is like, okay, well, let's drill down and see, is this authentic? Let's ask some hard questions. Like, could this be a fabrication? Could it be a legend, fraud, embellishments? And they use my book to kind of point out, no, there's no way that could possibly be true. And then, and just tell them the rest of the story, that there's this community that persists, and that's how we know, we could verify all these things, even thousands of years later, even with a lot of the evidence gone, you could still verify things. And while you're doing that, take them to Mass or take them to Eucharistic adoration.
That's good.
Give them radiation treatment. That's what I call it, because you can't be in the presence of Christ and not be changed, so show them that, this is part of that community, that 2,000-year-old community, and let God work on their hearts. But I think we kind of have to start the conversation. Like, you know what? There's this guy that totally reordered the world, and now most people only know him when they swear or something like that. It's like, who is this guy?
That's brilliant, Gary. I love that, because of course, for one thing, you're absolutely right on. It can't be assumed anymore in society. I mean, when there were times when we could assume people might know who Jesus is and be curious and have some kind of connection to him. I can think of the other day, I was at work, and somebody mentioned something, and I said a comment, and they said, "Well, how do you know that?" And I said, "Oh, well, didn't you read this?" And they go, well, "What do you mean? What's that?" And it was a book or a course that I thought everyone would of course know about, because I'm not that old, but they had no idea that it was even a thing. And I thought, wow, these things that at one point we could kind of assume about society have shifted very far and very quickly, right? You have a whole book about the revolt against reality, right, Gary? But we can't assume people are even curious about Jesus anymore. So we got to start with piquing their interest, with introducing sometimes, right, who Jesus is. Gosh, Gary, I still hear people talking about the idea that, right, if somebody isn't evangelized, they have perfect innocence, right? They have invincible ignorance about who Jesus is, and if you never heard the gospel, you can't be condemned to hell or something, right? Because you have not heard. And I think more and more these days, I think we really have to not become universalists, all of us, but widen that net of people who've actually not heard the gospel. Like, I think we still assume that people have, and really I think that assumption is becoming more and more thin. Like, do people really know who Jesus is? So I think starting there, Gary, I think is and then I love that you connect that to the community. Like, hey, here's this, here are these miracles, these stories. We can verify these from the sources. But look, we still exist today. We're still doing this. This mass is the same mass that you can find written about in these ancient sources, the Didache, Justin Martyr in 100 AD. Like we still do the same thing here. Come join us. Come check this out, right? And again, of course, if God is who he says he is, you walk into adoration, you'll sense a sense of peace, whether you're Catholic or not. There's something going on here.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I love that. The persistence of the church. Gary. That's like, what if I could show you a miracle that everybody would recognize, no one would doubt, and it's just obvious that it's occurring, and it's continued to occur for 2,000 years. Yeah. And the answer is the church, right? It's still here against all odds, against everything. Emperors have come and gone, empires have come and perished and been forgotten, and yet the Catholic Church still alive and well. It's spreading throughout the world. It's like a miracle in plain sight, and that, I think, that's a really, I like the way you put that, because it's like it's a natural tie to the gospel. It's like, how can this happen? Well, you know what? The Gospels seem to give a plausible explanation, because it's Christ's body, the church.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm gonna call that the Gary Michuta method now. We can trademark that and start and get a course going for that, Gary. Because I love that. That's a great way of leading people towards the Roman road that the evangelicals used in the 90s. We'll use the Michuta. We gotta work on this. Okay, there's got to be a catchy way of doing that.
Yeah, but that's right.
That's a great. I love that. That's genuine. That's beautiful. That's wonderful, Gary. This is a fantastic book. Kudos again for your work on this. It's awesome, and
thank you.
Everything you do. Spend the night. Get back to work, Gary. Get hunkered back down there in the studio and get working on the next book, because we'll see you in 4 years. Because we're really in debt to you in the work like this. This is awesome stuff, Gary. where do you want to point people towards where they can find this, buy this book? I'll put links in the show notes too to all this stuff. Okay. Listen to you. They can get a lot of Michuta if they want to. Gary, where do you want to point them towards?
Yeah, you could just go to Emmaus Road Press or St. Paul Center, St. Paul Center. I think it's dot. Boy, I should know this, com or org. Yeah, actually, like we mentioned before. Before we went on, this is like the second interview on my book, so I should know where they could get the book. But you could always Google it or whatever, and they'll come up.
Yeah. That's fantastic. And they can find your radio show, Gary. Don't sell yourself short here. Hands on Apologetics, fantastic radio show, available on podcast. I listen to it all the time. Awesome. One of, as you say, the 20 listeners who you think listen. There are many, many more than that. But
great. So now there's 19 besides you. Okay. Well, that's even less intimidating.
I'll put links to that in the show notes as well, Gary. And I should say, awesome. This is interview number 2 on this book, Gary, because before I even got an email that this book was being released, I caught wind of it and I emailed you to get on the train, because I know the stuff you do is fantastic and I wanted to get you on the show as soon as possible. So I got in early because I'm an early adopter of the Gary Michuta merchandise. So I got to say, I appreciate it, Gary. It's always a good time. God bless you. The work you are doing for the church. Don't stop, please. We love it, Gary. Thanks for being here, and take care.
All right. Well, thank you. You made my day.
You made mine. So we're both doing good.